folks. So, wanted to give you a quick tutorial on how to get started with stock and flow diagrams in Vensim. So, when you open Vensim, very often it'll give you this just blank canvas right here. And when you're looking at this blank canvas, it's important to be able to get to these model settings. And so, if you go up to the model menu and then go down to settings, it may give you this, do you want to save sketch to enable automated backup? We'll get to that in a second. But so if I go to model settings here, that allows me to then change these different settings that we have focused on in the spreadsheet example as these parameters that are necessary for us to do a numerical integration of the dynamical system. So an initial time, we almost always leave that at 0. Might change the final time. I'm going to say arbitrarily, I'm going to change it to 5. And then time step, this is the DT parameter or the time step parameter that we talk about in the spreadsheet example. It defaults to 1. I don't know what time step I'm going to actually need for my system. Sometimes I actually need to run my system a few times to try to figure out what's the appropriate time step, but I'm pretty sure it's probably not going to be 1. So I am going to then just set it arbitrarily to 0.01, but remember, I can always go back to model and settings to find this time step option elsewhere. Then I can do under units for time, I can actually change the unit. So month is a good unit, which is the default unit. If you're simulating a long process over, say, many months or many years, I'm going to change it to second. The other options and the other tabs here are for kind of more advanced things that you can do inside Vensim. For most of the things that we do inside this class, then final time, time step, and units are pretty much all we're going to worry about. All right, so I'm going to click OK, and then that will bring me back to my blank canvas. Now, if I were to instead have created a new model, and I'm going to say that I don't want to save this one, then the first thing I see are those model settings before it even opens up that canvas. So I'm going to then set those model settings again, and then I will keep working on our new model. Okay, so make that a little smaller. All right. Okay, so one of the first things I like to do, because I know that these diagrams I'll eventually probably want to put into a report, is change the default font so that they're a little bit bigger. So if I right-click on the background here, I can change the default size of the fonts to, say, 20 point. Now, if I go up to here, here's all my drawing tools. And so I want to create a stock, which Vensim calls a level. Older versions of Vensim, I think, call this a box variable. So, but they all are just the same name for, they're four different names for the same thing. So if I click on level and I click anywhere on the canvas, then I can now type in the name of my level. So I'm going to do a bacterial simulation. So I'll do bacteria, and it draws me this this box here, and I've got a handle that I can drag that up and down and edit it. And if I want to manually change its font settings, size, etc., I can right-click on that handle. Okay, so now I need flows. So I need a births flow and a deaths flow. So I'm going to click on rate, which is Vensim's name for flows. And I then, in order to make these work, you click once to start the rate somewhere, and then you double-click to finish the rate. And rates can start on stocks and they can end on stocks, or they can start on the canvas and they can end on the canvas. And so if I had another stock over here and I wanted one thing flowing from one stock into another, I might click on that other stock, double click on this stock. In this case, bacteria is my only stock, so I am going to just click on the canvas and then double click on bacteria, and then I'm going to click on bacteria and then double click on the canvas. And it will then pop up a thing wanting me to name this flow. I usually hit escape here because a lot of times in Vensim, when you double click on that canvas that way, Vensim will end up naming that little cloud at the end and not actually the flow. So it's a little better just to be sure on what's getting named by hitting escape. And then I can actually then manually double click on the flow that I want and then type in a name for the flow. And it is important to type in names for these flows if you plan on using these flows in later equations. And for example, Vensim uses these flows inside the way it integrates these bacteria. So whenever you create a flow, then make sure you also create a name for that flow. So births and deaths. All right, now I want to create a couple of converters or auxiliary variables. So we traditionally don't do that with the level here. We do that with just the plain old variable thing. So if I click on near the births here, I'll click on the canvas and I will say I want, all right, the average time until reproduction. And then you see it also puts a little handle here that allows me to make that bigger or smaller. Now, I like just having these unboxed or uncircled, but you might be more accustomed to seeing these converters or auxiliary labels with a circle around them. If I right-click on the handle, I can actually put a circle around it, or a bunch of other shapes, and that's what that would look like that. But I am okay with it being unboxed, so I kind of will take the causal loop diagram perspective of kind of minimizing clutter, and then I am going to just turn off that shape around it so that it looks like that again. So I can still move that around and everything, but now it is unboxed. So if you prefer the circle around it, I don't care. You can feel free to do that, but I'm going to leave it unboxed. But I am going to create another one, so I'm going to go back to variable, and I will create an average lifetime. Average. So there we are with the average lifetime. All right, so now that I've got all of my dynamic variables defined, stocks, flows, and these auxiliary variables, then I need arrows so that I can add these kind of causal links here. So I know that I will need average time until reproduction to calculate the birth flow, and I'm going to use the handle to make that a little rounded. I also, because in order to figure out the births flow, I need to know how many bacteria are currently alive and reproducing. So I need to then connect the bacteria to the births flow, and I can grab the little circle that's drawn and then give it this nice arc. Similarly for deaths, average lifetime goes into the deaths calculation, the deaths flow calculation. And also the number of bacteria goes into the deaths calculation. Okay, so this looks like I have a whole stock and flow diagram. If I go up here, so I might want to add annotations. So one other thing that you can do, if it improves the readability, is to annotate these links the same way you would do in a causal loop diagram. Now, I am not going to require that you annotate the links. And if you do annotate the links, I'm okay with you annotating a subset of the links. The annotations are there to improve the readability of the diagram for your reader. And so I might want to make it more clear to the reader that bacteria has a positive causal link on births. And so I can right-click on the handle, and I can say it has a positive causal link. I know that births then has another positive link to bacteria, that's kind of implied, but I might want to then have the reader focus on this being a reinforcing or positive feedback loop. So I can go to comment up here, and I can click to add a little annotation, and maybe I want to put a counterclockwise loop around that annotation, and maybe I want to put a plus in the center of that annotation, or maybe a graphic. So I could go down here to image and look through the graphics here. They have an image of a plus, so I might try using that. And then that will end up putting this annotation there, and I can grab the handle to make it larger or smaller. Oh, or smaller, if I can manage to get a hold of it. Good. So let's move this back in the middle of there. And that's an example of how you could add these annotations. So I could also annotate this loop right here. Add annotations if you think they help with the readability of your stock and flow diagram. I'm not going to require them, but they're often a good idea. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm not going to worry about those annotations, so I'm going to get rid of those two that I added, just to prevent any confusion. All right, so now we have a stock and flow diagram. Looks like a potentially functioning one, but we need to put those equations in. So we go to this equations tab, or equations button, and you notice that the dynamic variables, all now their backgrounds became black. And that indicates that there is an unresolved equation that we need to resolve before this thing can actually be simulated. So I'm going to then click on this average time until reproduction parameter, and I see that the equations here are empty, and that's why it's unresolved. And so I now need to say, all right, what is this in this parameter? What is my average time until reproduction? In our classroom example, it was 0.75. So I'm going to make that 0.75. And then the average lifetime in our classroom example was 3. So I'll put that 3. So we fixed those parameters. But now I need the formulas for births and deaths. So I click on births, and because I've drawn these causal links from average time to reproduction into births and bacteria into births, then down here we see that those variables show up as being available for us to use. So you can either type them in manually or you can just click on them. So I know for this births flow, I do bacteria divided by the average time until reproduction, and that gives me a birth rate. So this is number of bacteria per unit time. And so that gives me my flow here. And so right now it tells me that I've modified my equation. If I am worried that I might have typed something wrong, I can click check syntax, and now it says equation okay. If there was some syntax error, like I could, put a 1 there or something like that and hit check syntax, then it tells me that there's a problem. So get rid of that, check syntax, and now it looks like my equation's okay. Now in more advanced stuff, we can actually play with this units here, and we can say that we're expecting this to be, say, bacteria per second. And if Vensim otherwise knows that bacteria in the stock and flow diagram is in units of bacteria, and average time until reproduction is in units of seconds, then if I click check units, it actually can check to make sure that the formula I've implemented gives me these units out. For now, I'm going to leave these things unitless so that we don't have to worry about that. But eventually we will add the units back in, and you can make use of this check units. All right, now Vensim popped up this annoying, do you want to save the sketch to enable automated backup? I'm going to hit no right now, but I'm going to use that as a teachable moment. So that tells me that I really probably should save this sketch. So I'm going to go back here, and before continuing, I'm going to go up to File and hit Save As. And then I can save the sketch to, say, bacteria example.mdl. Now what that does for me is it not only prevents those annoying messages from popping up, but now periodically Vensim will save backups of my work in the background, not on top of the original file, but is in separate files with different file names that come after them, so that if Vensim ever crashes, there's actually a way to recover your work. And Vensim does crash very often, especially Vensim PLE. If you don't save once, it can't make those automated backups. So I highly recommend actually the first thing you do is to save your file and then to periodically save it as you go, because again, Vensim, you never trust it for being up for a very long amount of time before it crashes. All right, so I still have these two unresolved equations, so I'm going to go under deaths, and then for this equation, I'll do bacteria divided by average lifetime. And then now, this is a little weird, the stock says it as an unresolved equation. Now, what's weird about that is we normally don't think about the equation for stocks. We sort of assume that Vensim is going to implement the numerical integration for us so that we don't have to actually worry about doing any sort of programming of, or the mathematics behind the stocks. But what we do need to worry about is this initial value. So if I click on the equation, that certainly up here, as we see where it says integ births minus deaths, well, it just looked at our diagram and it said, well, I see you've got a flow coming in and a flow going out. So it automatically filled in that the formula for the integral that is being implemented by Vensim is just integrating births minus deaths. Well, we don't have to touch that. We let Vensim maintain that. But we still need to tell it what the initial condition of the stock is. How many are initially in the stock. How many bacteria do we initially have? So I'm going to say 1. If I say 0, then the bacteria can't grow because there's none of them available to start to being born. So these variables still show up down here, but in the case of initial conditions, it's true that you can put parameters in there because parameters don't change over the time of the simulation, but but you'll never put dynamic variables like another stock or something like that, and then almost always you'll just have a hard constant in this initial value. All right, so I click OK. And now all of those dynamic variables have the same white background, the canvas background here. And so it looks like my stock and flow is ready to go. Now up here it says simulation results file name. I can now change that to, it's currently set to current. So if I were to click simulate, it would generate a data set in the background in the same directory that I've saved this file called current.vdf, where VDF stands for Vensim data file. And that's fine, but I might want to be a little more descriptive and say, well, this data set corresponds to a certain set of parameters. And so I'm going to call this classroom example because I put the average time of reproduction to 0.75 and average lifetime to 3, which were the parameters I used in the classroom. Now, if I click simulate, nothing appears to happen. But if I click simulate again, it'll say data set classroom example already exists. Do you want to overwrite it? Which I can say yes. So you see, like if I were to click browse here, it shows me what's inside that folder, and I see the automated save that I was talking about here. I see my actual bacteria example model file, and then I also see this classroom example.vdf file, and so it has already been saved in that directory. And so I can now save additional ones with different names in there. Like, for example, I could change the average time to reproduction to a different value. And then if I were to hit simulate, it would then generate a different VDF file. So I'll do that later, but I just want to sort of show where we go from here, because very often you'll just generate one data file. All right, so I now would like to see what comes out of this. So if you look on the left-hand side here, there are our outputs, our ways we can interrogate something that has already been simulated. And there's a lot of advanced features here that I'm not going to go over in this small tutorial. I'm just going to mainly focusing on how to basically get your data out. All right, so if I just were to click on graph, then it shows me this curve here that just says classroom example, and it tells me bacteria here. So this basically is just, it found the stock here and it just plotted that stock over the 5 seconds of my simulation. Now sometimes you have multiple stocks, sometimes you actually want to plot the flows as well, and so you can actually click on things and say graph, and now it'll just plot the things you've clicked on. So now the births has a similar shape, but this is actually plotting the births. And so so if I were to highlight both, so I'm going to use the move size here, and I'm going to highlight both births and bacteria together. If I were to hit graph there, then now I see I have two curves. And down here in the legend, I see the blue one is the actual stock of bacteria, and the births, which is a rate, is the actual flow. And so these aren't the same thing, and that's why they aren't right on top of each other, but they're shaped the same because one is proportional to the other. And then it automatically put time second in the x-axis. And it says selected variables because those are the only ones I selected. So when they're not selected, Vensim will make its own intelligent choice about what it thinks you want to graph. And then otherwise, if you want to graph more things, you can highlight those more things and click graph. Now, when I'm looking at a graph, I can, let's say I plot multiple things, I can select to turn off some of those things so that I can kind of see what things look like. If things are laying on top of each other, that helps me see them. Or if I just generally don't want some other things, I only want to see one plot, I can do that. If I go up into this view menu up here, then or in some versions of Vensim, I think it's maybe in options. So view will show you some other things and options will show you that. So, but there should be, in older versions of Vensim that didn't have any of this, but in newer versions of Vensim, you should have some menus up here that allow you to adjust the plot. So I can say, I actually don't want a legend. I want to get rid of that. Or I would like to show this in black and white. Or I want to use dots instead of a line. Or I want to try other line patterns, and so on and so forth. And so you can change the way the plot looks by adjusting these options here. All right. And then once I've decided on how I want my plot to look, then I can actually either use the hotkey for copying, or I can go up to the view menu and I can select copy, and it'll copy the whole graph. And then if I went over into, say, a Word document and pasted, so if I went to like edit, paste, then I end up getting my graph out. Okay. So I'll just move that out of the way for now. Now, if you notice, there's units on the x-axis, but not on the y-axis. So we'd like to fix that, and there are more sophisticated ways we can put units on plots in Vensim that I might go over in a future lesson. But for now, if you just go back into the equations of the stock you want, or the thing that you want to plot, you can actually type in a unit there. So I can say my bacteria, maybe I want in units of Bactors. I'll just create a unit called Bactors. And then now, if I were to graph, then you can see that bacteria, the stock, is being plotted, and it actually puts units on the graph of Bactors. And so if I were to copy that and then bring it over into Microsoft Word, then now, there it is up here, my new plot has got those units on it. So that is a much better plot. Okay. Now, regardless of how nice you can make this in Vensim, sometimes you just want to plot it yourself, or sometimes you just want the data for other purposes, the raw data. Well, that's why there are these table options down here. So they work just like graph. So if I click on different things, if I use the move size and highlight different ones of these, then I can instead go, so I'm going to highlight births and bacteria. I can then click on either table or table time down. And if I click on, say, table time down, then it gives me a long list where I've got my time down this column, and whatever one variable I selected down this column, and the other variable I selected down this column. So if I want more variables, I just select more variables and click table. And then when it's in this form here, and now this is just like what you saw when you manually simulated these things in the spreadsheet. But I can now click save, and then it allows me to save as a text file. So I could call this, classroom example text, for example. And if I were then to go into Microsoft Word, so I'm going to close this up, or I'm sorry, Microsoft Excel, and I were then to open. So I'll do File, Open, and then I will open up these sample models. And so then Excel may need help figuring out what type of file it is. And so, but usually its guesses are going to be good. And so it figured out that this is tab delimited, and it looks like it put them in the right columns. So I can go through those, and eventually it'll pull up, and I've got all of those same data in Excel, just like I simulated in Excel to begin with, but with no formulas, because these were actually generated inside Vensim. But now once it's here, then I could select two columns, and then I could go to Insert and say Recommended Chart, and I could choose like a scatter plot, and then I can add a chart element, axis or axis title, primary vertical, and then here maybe I could put under axis title number of bacteria and Bactors, and then I'll add a chart element under axis titles, primary horizontal, and I'll say time seconds. And if I don't want this going till 6, then maybe I say format plot area. I'm sorry, not format plot area, select data. No, actually it's the axis I want to edit. So I will format axis, and then I'll say my maximum I want to actually force to be 5. And then that right there, in Excel, this looks a lot like the plot that we got earlier out of Vensim. So now I can adjust this plot as needed. So you can use that table option to end up getting the raw access to the raw data, so you have a lot more control. Okay, now, sorry, that was the table time down. Now, the only difference between table time down and table is that if I were to click on, say, now I'll do bacteria and deaths. If I were to do table, it actually does the same thing that table time down does, but it puts all the data in rows instead of columns. And so I can similarly save this out, and if I were to save it as like bacteria example rows, and then if I were to then go into Excel and open that bacteria example rows.txt, and then I could say, yeah, it's delimited, it's tab delimited, general format's fine. Then it brings up the same data, but it just put the data in the rows. So sometimes it's more convenient to have in rows, sometimes in columns. So I think most people, actually prefer it in this format. So, but the default table format puts it in rows. All right. Okay, so the last thing I think that I want to show you for this tutorial is if you did want to change these parameters, but you didn't want to get rid of some of your old data, well, you could go through here and you can go to equations, and I can maybe change this parameter. So let's say I want to make this a slower reproduction. Well, instead of saying that their average time to reproduction is 0.75, maybe I'll change it to 1.5. Okay. And so before I simulate, I can go up here and change this classroom example to something called maybe slow parameters. And now if I click simulate, it doesn't ask me if I want to overwrite anything because it now generated a new file. So if I had to click on browse and look into that folder, then I see now of a slow parameters VDF file. And if I were now to hit graph, then now I see, so I just hit graph and it thought I wanted to see average time until reproduction. So that's not that useful. So then I click on, I want to actually see bacteria, and click graph. And now notice that it actually has both data sets, the slow parameters and the classroom example. So both down here. And I can turn them on and off by clicking on these things. So they're both loaded, and that allows for easy comparisons. If I were to highlight multiple ones of these, so like births and bacteria, and click graph, then I get a lot more complicated looking plots. And so I've got the slow parameters bacteria and the classroom example bacteria. I've got the births from the slow parameters and the births from the classroom example. And so they're all here in the selected parameters. So that's an interesting way that you can compare these things. But you might eventually want maybe to get rid of these slow parameters. And so if you go to the control panel up here, it's this funny little box here, and I go to the Datasets tab, these are all of the data sets that are currently loaded in the model and ready to graph. And so I can unload them by saying, well, I actually don't care about my slow parameters, so I'll unload that. And so now if I were to go back and graph, then it's just the classroom example. And if I decide that I actually just don't care about these at all, then then I can just delete them. So I'll hit delete, and it'll say you want to delete them permanently, yes, and then that file is gone from the folder completely. So so that is a way that I can generate these stock and flow diagrams. I can update their parameters, so maybe I'll put that parameter back to what it was. And I can plot them in plots that have units correctly set. So, so that is a good start, and so that's where I'm going to leave the tutorial for now, and we'll do some more advanced work as we move further on in the class.